In a polar camp, says Admiral Byrd, little things like that have the power to drive even disciplined men to the edge of insanity. And you might have added, Admiral Byrd, that little things in marriage drive people to the edge of insanity and cause half the heartaches in the world. At least that's what the authorities say. For example, Judge Joseph Sabath of Chicago, after acting as arbiter in more than 40,000 unhappy marriages, declared, "Trivialities are at the bottom of most marital unhappiness." And Frank S. Hogan, former district attorney of New York County, says, "Fully half the cases in our criminal courts originate in little things. Barroom bravado, domestic wrangling, an insulting remark, a disparaging word, a rude action, those are the little things that lead to assault and murder. Very few of us are cruelly and greatly wronged. It is the small blows to our self-esteem, the indignities, the little jolts to our vanity, which cause half the heartaches in the world." When Eleanor Roosevelt was first married, she was worried for days because her new cook had served a poor meal. "But if that happened now," Mrs. Roosevelt said, "I would shrug my shoulders and forget it." Good. That is acting like an adult emotionally. Even Catherine the Great, an absolute autocrat, used to laugh the thing off when the cook spoiled a meal. Mrs. Carnegie and I had a dinner at a friend's house in Chicago. While carving the meat, he did something wrong. I didn't notice it, and I wouldn't have cared even if I had noticed it. But his wife saw it and jumped down his throat right in front of us. "John," she cried, "watch what you're doing. Can't you ever learn to serve properly?" And then she said to us, "He's always making mistakes. He just doesn't try." Maybe he didn't try to carve, but I certainly give him credit for trying to live with her for 20 years. Frankly, I would rather have eaten a couple of hot dogs with mustard in an atmosphere of peace than to have dined on Peking duck and shark fins while listening to her scolding. Shortly after that experience, Mrs. Carnegie and I had some friends at our home for dinner. Just before they arrived, Mrs. Carnegie found that 3 of the napkins didn't match the tablecloth. "I rushed to the cook," she told me later, "and found that the other 3 napkins had gone to the laundry. The guests were at the door. There was no time to change. I felt like bursting into tears. All I could think was, why did this stupid mistake have to spoil my whole evening? Then I thought, well, why let it? I went in to dinner determined to have a good time, and I did. I would much rather our friends think I'm a sloppy housekeeper," she told me, "than a nervous, bad-tempered one. And anyhow, as far as I could make out, no one noticed the napkins." A well-known legal maxim says, "De minimis non curat lex." The law does not concern itself with trifles. And neither should the worrier, if he wants peace of mind. Much of the time, all we need to overcome the annoyance of trifles is to effect a shifting of emphasis, set up a new and pleasurable point of view in the mind. My friend Homer Croy, who wrote They Had to See Paris and a dozen other books, gives a wonderful example of how this can be done. He used to be driven half crazy while working on a book by the rattling of the radiators in his New York apartment. The steam would bang and sizzle, and he would sizzle with irritation as he sat at his desk. "Then," says Homer Croy, "I went with some friends on a camping expedition. While listening to the limbs crackling in the roaring fire, I thought how much they sounded like the crackling of the radiators. Why should I like one and hate the other? When I went home, I said to myself, the crackling of the limbs in the fire was a pleasant sound. The sound of the radiators is about the same. I'll go to sleep and not worry about the noise." And I did. For a few days I was conscious of the radiators, but soon I forgot all about them. And so it is with many petty worries. We dislike them and get into a stew, all because we exaggerate their importance. Disraeli said, "Life is too short to be little." Those words, said André Maurois in This Week magazine, have helped me through many a painful experience. Often we allow ourselves to be upset by small things we should despise and forget. Here we are on this earth with only a few more decades to live, and we lose many irreplaceable hours brooding over grievances that in a year's time will be forgotten by us and by everybody. No, let's devote our life to worthwhile actions and feelings, to great thoughts, real affections, and enduring undertakings, for life is too short to be little. Even so illustrious a figure as Rudyard Kipling forgot at times that life is too short to be little, and the result? He and his brother-in-law fought the most famous court battle in the history of Vermont, a battle so celebrated that a book has been written about it, Rudyard Kipling's Vermont Feud. The story goes like this. Kipling married a Vermont girl, Caroline Balestier, built a lovely home in Brattleboro, Vermont, settled down and expected to spend the rest of his life there. His brother-in-law, Beatty Balestier, became Kipling's best friend. Two of them worked and played together. And then Kipling bought some land from Balestier with the understanding that Balestier would be allowed to cut hay off it each season. One day, Balestier found Kipling laying out a flower garden on his hayfield. His blood boiled. He hit the ceiling. Kipling fired right back. The air over the Green Mountains of Vermont turned blue. A few days later, when Kipling was out riding his bicycle, his brother-in-law drove a wagon and a team of horses across the road suddenly and forced Kipling to take a spill. And Kipling, the man who wrote, "If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you," he lost his own head and swore out a warrant for Balestier's arrest. A sensational trial followed. Reporters from the big cities poured into the town. The news flashed around the world. Nothing was settled. This quarrel caused Kipling and his wife to abandon their American home for the rest of their lives. All that worry and bitterness over a mere trifle, a load of hay. Pericles said 24 centuries ago, "Come, gentlemen, we sit too long on trifles." We do indeed. Here's one of the most interesting stories that Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick ever told, a story about the battles won and lost by a giant of the forest. On the slope of Long's Peak in Colorado lies the ruin of a gigantic tree. Naturalists tell us that it stood for some 400 years. It was a seedling when Columbus landed at San Salvador, and half-grown when the Pilgrims settled at Plymouth. During the course of its long life, it was struck by lightning 14 times, and the innumerable avalanches and storms of 4 centuries thundered past it. It survived them all. In the end, however, an army of beetles attacked the tree and leveled it to the ground. The insects ate their way through the bark and gradually destroyed the inner strength of the tree by their tiny but incessant attacks. A forest giant, which age had not withered, nor lightning blasted, nor storm subdued, fell at last before beetles so small that a man could crush them between his forefinger and his thumb. Aren't we all like that battling giant of the forest? Don't we manage somehow to survive the rare storms and avalanches and lightning blasts of life, only to let our hearts be eaten out by little beetles of worry, little beetles that could be crushed between a finger and a thumb? I traveled through the Teton National Park in Wyoming with Charles Seaford, highway superintendent for the state of Wyoming, and some of his friends. We were all going to visit the John D. Rockefeller estate in the park. But the car in which I was riding took the wrong turn, got lost, and drove up to the entrance of the estate an hour after the other cars had gone in. Mr. Seaford had the key that unlocked the private gate, so he waited in the hot, mosquito-infested woods for an hour until we arrived. The mosquitoes were enough to drive a saint insane, but they couldn't triumph over Charles Seaford. While waiting for us, he cut a limb off an aspen tree and made a whistle of it. When we arrived, was he cussing the mosquitoes? No, he was playing his whistle. I have kept that whistle as a memento of a man who knew how to put trifles in their place. To break the worry habit before it breaks you, here is Rule 2. Let's not allow ourselves to be upset by small things we should despise and forget. Remember, life is too short to be little. Chapter 8. A law that will outlaw many of your worries. As a child, I grew up on a Missouri farm, and one day, while helping my mother pick cherries, I began to cry. My mother said, "Dale, what in the world are you crying about?" I blubbered, "I'm afraid I'm going to be buried alive." I was full of worries in those days. When thunderstorms came, I worried for fear I would be killed by lightning. When hard times came, I worried for fear we wouldn't have enough to eat. I worried for fear I would go to hell when I died. I was terrified for fear of an older boy, Sam White, would cut off my big ears as he threatened to do. I worried for fear girls would laugh at me if I tipped my hat to them. I worried for fear no girl would ever be willing to marry me. I worried about what I would say to my wife immediately after we were married. I imagined that we would be married in some country church, and then get in a surrey with a fringe on top and ride back to the farm. But how would I be able to keep the conversation going on that ride back to the farm? How? I pondered over that earth-shaking problem for many an hour as I walked behind the plow. As the years went by, I gradually discovered that 99% of the things I worried about never happened. For example, as I've already said, I was once terrified of lightning. But I now know that the chances of my being killed by lightning in any one year are, according to the National Safety Council, only 1 in 350,000. My fear of being buried alive was even more absurd. I don't imagine that even back in the days before embalming was the rule, that 1 person in 10 million was buried alive, yet I once cried for fear of it. 1 person out of every 8 dies of cancer. If I had wanted something to worry about, I should have worried about cancer instead of being killed by lightning or being buried alive. To be sure, I've been talking about the worries of youth and adolescence, but many of our adult worries are almost as absurd. You and I could probably eliminate 9/10 of our worries right now if we would cease our fretting long enough to discover whether, by the law of averages, there was any real justification for our worries. The most famous insurance company on earth, Lloyd's of London, has made countless millions of dollars out of the tendency of everybody to worry about things that rarely happen. Lloyd's of London bets people that the disasters they're worrying about will never occur. However, they don't call it betting, they call it insurance. But it is really betting based on the law of averages. This great insurance firm has been going strong for over 200 years, and unless human nature changes, it will still be going strong 50 centuries from now by insuring shoes and ships and sealing wax against disasters that, by the law of averages, don't happen nearly so often as people imagine. If we examine the law of averages, we will often be astounded at the facts we uncover. For example, if I knew that during the next 5 years I would have to fight in a battle as bloody as the Battle of Gettysburg, I would be terrified. I would take out all the life insurance I could get. I would draw up my will and set all my earthly affairs in order. I would say, I'll probably never live through that battle, so I had better make the most of the few years I have left. Yet the facts are that, according to the law of averages, it is just as dangerous, just as fatal, to try to live from age 50 to age 55 in peacetime as it was to fight in the Battle of Gettysburg.